right. Howdy, everybody. Good afternoon. How's everybody feeling? You work off some of your sandwich? Wake up a little bit? All right, let's do some learning. Welcome. This is Opening the Black Box. Becoming a better developer through debugging, because I really don't like short titles. My name is Dustin Younse. I am at Mills Yodpath, basically everywhere on the internet. It was a very old joke from high school, and it has haunted me ever since. But once you pick a name, you got to stick with it. I am currently an engineer at Acquia. We are a small managed hosting company based out of Boston. You might have heard of us. I work, I should update that. We are now Enterprise Applications is the name of my team. We work on a lot of the internal tools. So basically nothing that anybody would ever see. It's just a lot of plumbing, which has given me a lot of opportunity to work on my debugging skills, because a lot of it feels like you're fumbling around in the dark. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of info in here, a lot of things you might want to take notes about, but don't worry, because this presentation is already up on my GitHub account. So you can go there, you can download the PDF, so you don't have to worry about writing down all these URLs. So let's get started. The $64,000 question: what is debugging? This is kind of a, it's kind of a philosophical intro to this. So what is debugging? This, if you don't know Glitch, Glitch is an online service that it lets you do some really cool JavaScript type things, like server-side style JavaScript in the browser. And they have a pretty nice, kind of community outreach channel. And I enjoy following their Twitter account. And so they asked one day last summer, what is the worst thing you've ever done? Like, what is your biggest screw up? The person running the account, they let us know. Their code once took down a client's intranet mid-demo to the client. That's pretty bad. This guy, he responded. This is Zach Holman. If you don't know, he was one of the original GitHub developers. And apparently he once shipped GitHub to production in development mode. I can only imagine that had a great performance ramifications. This is Jen Schiffer. She's a JavaScript developer. She works for Glitch. And she used to work for the NBA. And apparently, she took down the entire China NBA site while switching the nets from their former home in New Jersey to the new home in Brooklyn years after they actually moved. Those tickets, they fill in the backlog. This, I'm just going to warn you, is the all-time greatest. You'll never beat this. My first client patch caused all the W-2s to print with the deceased box checked. It was a nunnery. I killed an entire nunnery. You can't beat that. But of course, I had to add my own. I used to work at the University of Texas. I worked in the library. And on the first day of the spring semester, I took down the entire library website with a botched FTP transfer of the htaccess file. This was super fun. Technically not my fault. Technically, it was my FTP client's fault. But I'm the one with the gray hair. So, what is debugging? Debugging is when you have a problem and you have to figure out how to fix it. This talk, it's pretty Drupal-centric in my examples, but these kinds of things apply to any kind of development. This is something you might have seen in WordPress or in Drupal, where all of a sudden your site is only showing text. Pretty stressful. But what does it mean? What kind of issues could have caused this? In Drupal, it's pretty common if your CSS aggregation is turned on, but the files haven't been cached or they're cached incorrectly. This is something that happens a lot when you're moving databases around, because the database will reference an aggregated CSS file that doesn't exist on production when it existed on your staging server. This used to be kind of a joke, but it's becoming more and more common, surprisingly. Maybe they have JavaScript blocked in the browser. This used to be the kind of thing that only very paranoid people do, but now we're all pretty paranoid. Turns out they know a lot about us, and we don't want them to know so much. So a lot of people have started installing things like Ghostery or other types of tracking blocking software. And any number of those can actually affect the JavaScript rendering and can take down an entire page. Particularly nowadays, when a lot of front ends are incredibly JavaScript heavy or JavaScript dependent if you're using something like React. In Drupal land, the file permissions of your site's default files folder. That's the folder where everything dynamically generated is going to live. All of your images, all of your JavaScript, all of your CSS. So we've got 3 different things that could be the problem causing this one error. And this is when we start talking about what is the difference between debugging and troubleshooting. Honestly, it's mostly a semantic difference. For me, did it take me 5 minutes to fix it, or did it take me 5 hours to fix it? Is a pretty good definition. And did I fix it, or did I understand the problem and correct the problem? A deeper level of understanding that is what I consider debugging to be. It's a little bit, it's deeper. You're not just clearing cache. You're figuring out why the thing is wrong, and then fixing it hopefully forever. And hopefully it doesn't happen again. So what is this black box that I'm discussing? Tell me if this is a familiar story to you. Perhaps you have a non-technical education. I personally have a film degree and a psychology degree and another film degree because I really like film school. It's a lot of fun. You mostly have self-taught web skills. I got into web development because I was making movies and my friends were making movies and everybody wanted to put their movies on the internet. And I'm old enough that I lived in a world without YouTube. So it was really hard to put your movies on the internet. So I could make decent beer money by putting my friends' videos on the internet. You probably have above average Googling abilities or DuckDuckGoing abilities. If you're a little more paranoid. I think this is the superpower of basically any developer nowadays. There is so much knowledge that is required just to put hello world on a web browser. It's almost foolish to even attempt to learn everything. You don't need to have automatic recall. You just need to know how to find the answers that you need. If it's something you're doing over and over again, you're going to learn how to do that pretty good. But there's nothing wrong with Googling. Life is an open book test. It's pretty great that way. And of course, you've probably spent long days and late nights staring at an error message, pulling your hair out, drinking too much caffeine, getting really cranky. And this is my life. Now, what is Drupal? And here, if you're not familiar with Drupal, just insert the name of whatever it is that you work with. Maybe it's WordPress, maybe it's .NET, maybe it's React. Drupal in this case is just a complicated system, and we need to know how to understand that system. So the first thing that you do when you're trying to understand something is you try to put together a mental model. And when I first started doing Drupal, I've been doing Drupal now for 11 years? 11 years, that sounds right. And in 11 years, basically what Drupal means to me. It's a black box. It's this impenetrable monolith. There's no ins, there's no outs, but it works. I know that when I point somebody to the website, it's going to show them a page. And that's what it's going to look like until it doesn't. Until you put in those 10,000 hours or whatever it is, and you've read the books, you've read the blog posts, you've been writing code, and all of a sudden your understanding of Drupal shifts to this. It's no longer an impenetrable black monolith. It's now an impenetrable black monolith that you recognize as Drupal and has an indicator light. So we haven't really moved our understanding very much, but that's okay. We'll try and figure that out. This is where I take a somewhat silly aside. Has anybody ever read the book Maniac McGee by Jerry Spinelli? This is one of my all-time favorite books, like literally ever. It is the story of a young boy who is orphaned and his growing up between two worlds. The small town in Pennsylvania, literally a good side of the tracks and a bad side of the tracks kind of story. But Maniac McGee has a superpower. Maniac McGee can untangle any knot in existence. So he is the kid that the other kids come to when their shoes are knotted up, when their yo-yo strings get knotted up, when their kites tangle around a tree. He's the guy that can fix it for him. In this town, there is a pizzeria called Cobble's Pizza, and out front is a flagpole. On this flagpole is hanging a rope, and on that rope is the ugliest, gnarliest knot you've ever seen. This is a knot that's been there, as far as the kids are concerned, for eternity. It is an impossible knot that nobody could ever untangle. It's so impossible that the pizzeria has decided to have a contest. Anyone who can untangle this knot will win free pizza for an entire year. And, you know, for a kid, that's better than winning the lottery. If you win the lottery, you just have money. But if you have free pizza, you've got pizza. That's awesome. So, because Maniac has a superpower, all of his friends are like, Maniac, you absolutely have to go untangle this knot. And then we'll be able to eat free pizza forever. And he's like, okay, I guess I can do that. So he goes to the knot. And next to the knot is a picnic table. And he sits down at that table. And, you know, at this point, everybody in town knows that this is happening. So all these kids are coming from all over to watch Maniac snap his finger and make this knot fall apart. But then he doesn't. He just sits there. He stares at it. He stares at it. He gets up. He walks over to it. You know, he walks around. He looks at all sides. He's studying this knot. He wants to know what makes this knot a knot. He spends all day just looking at it. The kids get bored. They walk away. And then he goes home. He hasn't even touched the knot. But then the next day, he comes back out and he starts untangling it. He starts poking. He starts pulling a little bit of rope here, a little bit of rope there. He never gets frustrated. He just works methodically. And by the end of the day, the knot is untangled. So, what does that mean? Let me show you Drupal. So this is a graph of function calls for a single piece of the Drupal 7 render pipeline. This isn't all of it. This is just a little bit of it. This is what it looks like in Drupal 8. Same, you know, like the same kind of chunk. And this is to say, you go to your browser, you type in an address. That's the signal going into Drupal. Out the other side of Drupal comes a web page. And this is everything that's in the middle. So it's our job to try and understand the knot. We need to look at the rope and see, you know, it's one in, one out, but there's a whole bunch of things going on, a whole lot of complications. So let's start at the beginning. Let's sit down at the picnic table and just look at the knot. Because if you get impatient and all you have is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. This is one of the all-time greatest hammers in existence. This is the PHP Hammer, the hammer that can do everything and nothing all at once. So if this is the only hammer you have, obviously you're not going to do very good building a house. So we need to start thinking about our tools. This was the moment when I started thinking of myself as a professional developer, when I started thinking of my tools as proper tools. They were no longer just like this thing I had to use. There were things that I wanted to learn, things I wanted to customize, things that made me a more efficient developer. And this starts, as always, with text editors. This is the #1 thing. Like, you have to have a text editor to do anything. You could get fancy on the command line, but let's not. We'll just focus on text editors. And there's kind of 3 flavors. There's text editors and quotes, text editors, and IDEs, or integrated development environments. So we're going to look at a couple of those. So what do I mean by text editors, kind of, sort of? These are things like Notepad on Windows. This is where I started. I'm sure a lot of you started there. These are things like TextEdit on a Mac, Nano if you're on a Linux machine or a Mac. These are tools that let you open a file, see the text, edit the text, save the file. They're not going to have any kind of syntax highlighting. They're not going to have a lot of nice hotkeys to swap lines around. They're not going to know anything intelligently about your code. They're just going to treat it like text, and they let you get in, do what you need to do, and get back out. In a pinch, there's nothing wrong with these. If this is what you have available to you, you can get work done. But at a certain point, it's nice to level up. And that's where we come to text editors. These are things like Notepad++ on Windows. These are things like Dreamweaver, believe it or not, on Mac or Windows. Sublime Text, Atom, and one of my new favorites, Microsoft VS Code. Shout out to Microsoft for that product. Or Vim, if you're on a Mac or a Linux machine. So Notepad++, as the name implies, is just like Notepad, but it has a little bit more. It has plugins available. It can do syntax highlighting. Dreamweaver. So I used to work at a university. If you don't know, universities are very weird about spending money. They wouldn't even consider buying me, anything that costs more than $1. But as a whole, the university had a multi-million-dollar contract with Adobe, so any of us could have Dreamweaver for free. And if you turn off all of the visual stuff in Dreamweaver, it actually has a pretty serviceable text editor built into it. You can do your syntax highlighting. You can fold your code. There's lots of nice things that you can do if you just ignore all the crufty stuff that Dreamweaver is so bad about. Sublime Text and Atom. Atom is basically GitHub's clone of Sublime Text. They just decided to make it slower. These are two very, very flexible text editors. They're available all over the place. Basically any computer you can install one of these two on. They have thousands of plugins available. You can put the clock at the bottom of the page. You can put controls for your iTunes at the bottom of the page. Completely extensible. Atom is just HTML and JavaScript, so you can literally do anything if you know the right JavaScript incantations. Microsoft VS Code. So this is a newer one that Microsoft dropped, and it's available everywhere, Mac, Linux, or Windows. This is particularly well suited, I find, for JavaScript development because a lot of JavaScript developers use it, and that means there's a lot of very good JavaScript features built in or available as plugins. It's free. It works really well. I think, given the choice, I would actually take VS Code over Atom any day because it's nice. It does a lot of really good stuff. And Vim. This is, I think I looked it up, and Vim is 45 years old. It's been through a lot. It can do a lot. It can open any file. I really love using Vim if I'm in a situation where I have an incredibly large file that I need to do something very simple with. Like if you've ever tried opening a 1 gig database backup text editor, that's going to slow things down really fast. But if you do it in Vim, Vim doesn't care. I've opened 10 gig files in Vim, and it doesn't even blink. It is old. It is highly optimized, and you can do really cool stuff. You can pop open a database. You can find and replace, and then you can close the file, and it's done in literally seconds. It's pretty rad. And because it's old and because a lot of people use it, it also has a ton of different plugins. It's not as friendly. It's kind of the Chinese finger traps of text editors because you can accidentally open a Vim window and then not know how to escape it. But once you learn the basics, Vim is really great and incredibly powerful. That brings us past text editors into integrated development environments. It's a very long word for fancy text editors. These include things like PHP Storm, Eclipse, or Komodo. So what makes an integrated development environment different from a text editor is that it is specifically tuned generally to a single language or a couple of languages. So like the name implies, PHP Storm is designed to edit PHP files. It can do HTML, it can do JavaScript, but all of its more advanced features are based around PHP. Eclipse is used a lot in the Java world, but it can be used in a lot of different cases. Komodo I've never personally used, but I've added it to this list just for completeness sake. The nice things about these are not only can you edit your code, not only will it color the syntax of your code, but it actually can have intelligence about your code. So, when you're typing out a function name, it not only can autocomplete the name of the function, it can tell you what arguments you have to put into that function, which is super useful. It's not the kind of thing that you couldn't look up on your own, but it's the kind of thing that saves you a couple of seconds, something that you do 100 times a day, and all of a sudden you're walking out the door at 4:30 instead of being stuck in the office until 7. My favorite thing about PHP Storm, the one thing I can't live without, is the ability to dive into the code. So when you see a function or a method used inside of a file, if you click on the name of that, it will open the file that has that function or method inside of it. So, if you've looked at Drupal, if you've looked at WordPress, it's basically just a giant stack of files, and they're all talking to each other. And so with this, instead of having to Control F and search for a function name and dig through 19 different results, you click once, it takes you directly to where that function came from. You can see the documentation if somebody wrote the documentation. You can see all the arguments. You can see the return type, all of that stuff. It's super great. If nothing else, PHP Storm is worth it for that. I've tried making that work in things like Sublime Text or Atom, but it just doesn't work. I love PHP Storm. It's really good. It costs money, which sucks, compared to other things, like other free options. But I think as a professional developer, it is 100% worth it. And they have educational licenses. If you are a open source contributor, they're now giving out free licenses. They just announced that through Drupal. I know they do it through a couple other projects. So that's really nice. So that's IDEs. And of course, we can't forget operating systems that have built-in text editors, like Emacs. This is the nerdiest joke you'll ever hear. Exactly 2 people have ever laughed at this, and I've given this talk a bunch. Emacs, if you didn't know, is kind of the spiritual sibling of Vim. If you are ever hanging out with more than 3 nerds and you mention Vim or Emacs, there's a 100% chance the other one will come up, and then people will start fighting about it because people are very opinionated if they like one of these 2. Emacs, like Vim, is incredibly powerful. It's based on the command line, but Emacs is, it can do anything. It is literally basically its own operating system. People have built in, GTD-style task management features into Emacs. You can get calendars inside of Emacs. You can live inside of Emacs in a way that you can't do in basically anything else, which is crazy. I've tried using it. It's just too much for me, but maybe it's the one that you'll love. I'm not trying to say any of these are better than the others. Try them out, see what you like. So we're editing our text, but how do we actually do something with it? Unlike a plain HTML file, PHP has to be run. It has to go through a process on the server before anybody can look at it. So we need some type of development environment. The first one that a lot of people use is on your server. This means you are logging into the server, SSH, and you are manually editing the files directly on the server. Hopefully, this isn't your production server, but maybe it is. After a while, you kind of level up and you start working on your machine. And then after that, you do it on your machine, but you figure out how to trick it into thinking it's just like the server. So what does that mean? So for local development, this is FTP development, often called cowboy coding. This is what led to me breaking the library's website because we didn't have development servers. We had the production server. And I needed to make an update. So I dragged a folder onto the server over my FTP client. And somehow my FTP client lost the first 2 characters of the htaccess file. Everything else is fine, but 2 characters got deleted. Turns out those are very important characters. And this is why we call it cowboy coding, because it's real risky. And because saying cowboy is kind of fun, I guess. I don't know. Local environments, these are going to be things like MAMP or LAMP. You may have heard these terms. And then there's kind of a next generation using technologies like Vagrant or Docker. So FTP development, cowboy coding. But one of the biggest drawbacks to this is there's no revision control up front. And so this is what would have saved me in that one case where I broke the library website. But because you're just editing text files directly on the server, as soon as you hit save, that's now the live file. There's no easy way to roll that back. You don't get Git, you don't get SVN, you don't get any of those niceties. You have very little debugging visibility. And so this is what's most important to us is how can we actually see what's happening, what's going wrong. You might have access to the log files. In the case of the university libraries, I did not have access to the log files. I could access Drupal logs, but I couldn't see what the server was doing. And so anything that was breaking upstream of Drupal, I had no way of knowing. You need to do debug statements, little print Rs or var dumps. Maybe you have access to the watchdog logs. And this is, again, only if you have the permission to do that. And not everybody does, depending on how your Drupal setup is done. So what's a debug statement? These are things like print R, which just gives you a raw dump of a variable. Something like that. Print R node will just dump out everything Drupal knows about the node at the point where you type that in. One quick and dirty tip, if this is something you're using, and everybody uses it, I use this all the time, you put pre-tags around your print R, because the print R is, as it says, the raw dump. It is all of the information, no line breaks, no spaces. It is just a big blob of text. But if you drop in the pre-tags, then in your browser, you get a little bit of formatting to help you read through it, which is really nice. You've got tools like DSM or Kent. These give you a formatted dump. DSM is part of the Devel module of Drupal. Kent is a Symfony component, so it works with any type of PHP, any kind of PHP development that you have it built into. But it is also the preferred way to do it inside of Drupal 8, which is not based on Symfony. And these are going to give you a formatted dump. So it's going to, they generally fold the code so you can kind of read through large dumps a little bit easier. And, just look something like that, just DSM node. DSM stands for Devel set message, I believe. And yeah, so when you are on your local server, these are kind of the things you have access to. This is what you can affect, is the directly affect the code. But if we move up and we start thinking about something like MAMP or Dev Desktop or native LAMP stack. So LAMP, if you don't know, that's Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, which is just a shorthand for probably the most common web development stack on the internet. MAMP is the Macintosh version of that. So it's Mac OS, Apache, MySQL, PHP. And it's available as a product, both free and paid, that you just install on your computer, and it takes care of the hard work for you. There's also Dev Desktop, which is an Acquia product I'm obligated to mention. And it is much like MAMP. You install it, it hooks up to Acquia, you pull your files, you can start working. And it is designed to look like an Acquia server. So it's going to have the same PHP versions and the same MySQL versions and all of that. In this case, the code is running entirely locally on your laptop. You're not touching the server until you have to, which gives you an added bonus. You can work offline. One of the nice things since I moved to the north, I learned about train travel. Super great. I used to work for a company based in New York City, and a couple times a year, they would bring me into the city for whatever, and I would get 4 hours sitting on a train working. And I didn't have to worry about internet because I had everything set up on my laptop. It's just like a plane, except it's infinitely more comfortable, which is really great. Go Amtrak. I love it. You'll have access to print R, DSM, Kent, all those kinds of things. But now you get access to something really important and really awesome and really powerful that we'll talk a bit about, and that's XDebug. So we'll get in a little bit more depth on what XDebug is, but just know that it's a superpower of your own that you get to apply to PHP. It's pretty rad. And then there is the next generation. These are things like Calabox Orlando, which is the new version of it. These have direct integrations with Acquia and Pantheon and Platform SH. There are also Drupal VM or Homestead, are both Vagrant style boxes. So Calabox Orlando is based on Docker, which you may have heard of. It uses a thing called containers, which is a fancy way of saying tiny little servers that live on your computer. And they have integrations already built for Acquia, Pantheon, and Platform, so they just act exactly like those servers act, which is really nice. Drupal VM is a product of a guy named Jeff Geerling, who is super rad, and I'm pretty sure doesn't sleep because he's just always pumping out new updates of Drupal VM. Homestead comes from the Laravel community, I believe, and so it is just a Vagrant stack tuned for Laravel-style PHP development. Vagrant is a slightly older way of virtualizing a server on your local computer. It works great. I honestly kind of prefer it to Docker for several reasons, but any of these are going to work great. A lot of times it's not up to you; it's up to your company or your team, because the most important thing is to pick one of these and stick with it. It makes your life a lot easier. So these give you the print R, the DSM, the Kent, the XDebug. On top of that, they give you very accurate performance profiling. So this is a point where you might start being concerned about too many people coming to your website or too many people accessing a certain thing. This happens. Think about like NFL.com. How many people are going to NFL.com in June? Probably not a lot of people. How many people go to an Olympics website in an odd-numbered year? Probably not a lot. But if it is the day of the Super Bowl, or if it is the Winter Olympics, a lot of people are going to come to your website because all of a sudden they care about it. And you want to be able to know that it's not just going to fall on its face, or hope that you know that it's not going to fall on its face. And you now have access to tools like XHProf, or its more modern forks, Blackfire or Tidewater. So XHProf, it's a product of Facebook. I believe the last time I gave this talk, XHProf did not work on PHP 7, but I think there might have been some movement in that regard. But Blackfire and Tidewater are two separate forks of the XHProf codebase that are designed to work with PHP 7. They both are available as just free software, and then they have services that you can pay money for, but you do get access to just the raw data for free. And these are profilers. So these, if you've ever heard of New Relic, it's very similar to that, but you get to control the access to it. And you load a page, and then it will spit out a graph that tells you exactly what took so long for that page to come up. It's really, really great for finding bottlenecks and like database calls. If you are building a page that needs to reach into 7 different database tables, that can start taking a lot of time if you're pulling a lot of data out of each of those. And so this will say, you're making this call 7 different times. Maybe try putting them into a single call. That one single call may take longer by itself, but in aggregate, it can be faster. It can be cached and things like that. So that's what, when you're working with the more native style of Calabox or Docker or a Vagrant, you can start seeing things like that, which is really nice. So I promised I'd tell you about your superpower. What is XDebug? Does anybody know XDebug? Has anybody used XDebug? You've got 1, 2. Have you ever done it successfully the first time?
Depends.
The perfect answer for XDebug.
No, it took Honestly, okay, so just quickly, it took a while to get it up and running. That means Linux, you know, it's not, it's a little esoteric.
Yeah.
To figure out the setup. Right now, I'm trying to get it to work on Windows with Docker for Windows. Okay, using VS Code, just because it's a challenge.
I feel for you.
Yeah. So if you have any tips,
run far away. That's not something I would try without a lot of alcohol on hand. So XDebug is a step-through debugger. So what is step-through debugging? It literally allows you to hit pause on your web server. It lets you inspect the current state of the stack. In quotes. So when you run, you open a web page, you go to a site. The server is doing work in the background to generate the page that you're going to see. XDebug, once you have it properly configured, lets you pause that at any point in the code that you want to pause it. And you can see at that moment exactly what's going on. It lets you inspect the current state of the stack. And if you think back to that long function call, the stack refers to every single file that is currently in use. So you go to index.php, that goes to bootstrap.php, that goes to another, on and on and on. Each of those files is now part of the stack. And so you can start digging through and finding out that maybe the problem isn't with your code, but 3 function calls in, there's a bug that is causing some type of issue that you had no visibility into because you're just focusing on your code. And this is the greatest part. It lets you modify the values live. I love this a lot. I will attempt to give a brief demo at the end, only because it has worked 1 out of 4 times. So we do that at the end, so it's less embarrassing when it doesn't work. So we've talked about our tools. We're more comfortable with our tools. Now we have to put our tools into action because something is broken. Previously to my current job, I was a support developer, which meant that my default state was panic and terror. My life was literally things were broken in production and I had to fix them. And that's, I learned a lot about Zen at that point, a lot about not letting the externalities affect me as much. They still do, but less. I no longer look like this because I learned the first step in debugging is relax. You have to stop. You have to, if your heart is racing, you have to let it stop racing. You have to start thinking through the problem. I love this tweet. If you don't know DHH, he is the creator of Ruby on Rails. And he likes to say, unless you're making software for rockets, self-driving cars, or pacemakers, ease off the mission-critical bullshit, eh? There's a lot of self-importance in technology. It's one of the things I miss the most about a university because they just really don't care. Most people in a university are kind of mad that technology exists. But when you work in tech companies, people are they're like, oh, well, this has to be running. Does it? Does it really? Anybody here work, I don't know, in a nuclear silo or hospital software that runs pacemakers? Okay, good. We're cool. If that's the case, then yeah, maybe you do need to panic. But hopefully you're not using Drupal to run that. So you need to relax. You need to realize that just because the website is down, it's not the worst thing in the world. There are worse things in the world. Think about the knot. Getting angry at that knot isn't going to untangle that knot any faster. The knot is just going to be the knot. And you have to learn to just kind of relax and think through the problem, even when you're getting yelled at by a client. So again, we need to think about what's broken. Is something not showing up that is supposed to show up? Maybe, is it new content? Executive, remember to publish that new content. This is surprisingly common, particularly when you start using things like workflow management tools. And it's amazing how often things just get stuck as a draft and just never show up. Is it old content? Are the permissions set properly? When you're using Drupal, it is common practice when you move to like a new version of Drupal to have two separate content types for the old content and the new content. And they each get their own set of permissions. So did you remember to give anonymous users permissions to view the old content? Is something showing up that shouldn't? Is raw HTML and JavaScript being dumped out on the page because somebody copy and pasted something from Stack Overflow into a WYSIWYG edit window? I've never seen that happen. So we need to figure out what's broken. Then we need to work from the bottom up. Log files. This might be the most important thing you'll hear in this entire talk. You should learn how to find your log files before you need your log files. If you have access, you need to know, do I have access to them? You need to know, how do I access them? And you need to know, what they mean, what you're looking at. There's a great tool I really love called Multitail. So if you've ever logged into a server, you've looked at log files, you probably use something like cat or less or tail. Tail in particular lets you watch the log file scroll by, so you look super cool like a hacker. Multitail makes you look even more like a hacker because it lets you view the logs, but more. So you can add color to the output so that as the log is scrolling by, each line is a different color. So you can more easily see when something is new on the screen. It lets you look at multiple log files at the same time, which is one of my favorite things, because when you're thinking about the LAMP stack, something could be happening at the Linux level, something could be happening at the Apache web server level, something could be happening at the MySQL level, something could be happening at the PHP or Drupal level. And you can view all of those logs at once, and you can start correlating, oh, when this error happens over here, I see a crash dump over here. We do some really cool stuff just by kind of flipping the view. So we need to figure out where it's broken. We know that it is broken. We know kind of what is broken. And now we need to figure out where it's broken. This is commonly going to be in a custom module if you're working with Drupal. It could be in the theme layer in your template.php, your theme file if you're on Drupal 8. It could be in the theme template itself. These are the common places because these are the pieces of a system like Drupal that you touch as a developer if you're doing it right. Because you shouldn't be going in and editing the core Drupal code. You should only be adding your own custom code. So these are going to be common places that it breaks. And again, you got to relax. I like to think of this as the scientific method. And that is truly what I feel that debugging is. You change one thing at a time, only one. You test that change. Did it fix the problem? Did it not fix the problem? Repeat. And that's what you do. You come at it from a scientific point of view. You change one line of code. You change one checkbox in the admin, whatever it is. Do one thing, see if that fixed it, and then try again. It's very, very easy, particularly when somebody's yelling at you, to start clicking this and editing this code, commenting that out, clearing the cache, doing all of these things at once. All of a sudden it works, and you're no longer being yelled at, but you don't actually know what fixed it. And even worse, you may have introduced another problem later through some unrelated situation. For that, Git is your friend. Oh, I'm running slow. Git is version control. It lets you save your progress as you work. It lets you do things in Drupal like recreate your features or your config YAML. So you can take all of those checkboxes and put them somewhere safe. And it just helps make these rabbit holes more manageable because you have a history of what you've done, so you know exactly what you changed, and you're able to spread that basically throughout the code base. There's a really great command called git bisect. It lets you isolate changes between your Git commits, which lets you do something like this. So there's a book. It's in the notes section at the end of the slides, Art of Troubleshooting. And they have this example of a assembly line where a standard teddy bear is turned into a Christmas teddy bear. And as you can see, there's something terribly wrong in this assembly line. And there are 45 different steps where this could have broken. So as much as I, a film student who never liked math, is loath to admit, math knows the right answer to quickly figuring out what the problem is, and that's to bisect it. So instead of starting at 1 or starting at 45, you start right in the middle, or as close as you can get. You open the door, you inspect it, and you say, is it wrong or is it right? And if it's wrong, then you move back that way because you know the problem started before. And if it's right, then you just keep moving the other way. And you go step by step until you find exactly what it is. Git diff is a really good tool. It helps you remember to remove all of those debug statements that you put in your code. It ensures that you only changed as much as you actually needed to change. More than once, I've commented out an entire file to get rid of an entire branch of code, and then forgot to uncomment that when I went to push the change to production. And of course, you only push a debug statement like ugh to master once. It's very embarrassing. There's actually a much worse word than that, and my boss was very mad at me. Git Blame, it's a little bit more advanced. It helps you find your enemies, by which I mean it helps you as your friend. Yeah, so Git Blame is also known as Git Annotate, which is a much nicer word for it, but it's much harder to type. But what Git Annotate does is help you track down who wrote the code that broke a thing. And it's very important that this is not a witch hunt. It's a chance to find out the context for an issue. We've all written crappy code, and a lot of times when we wrote the crappy code, we actually knew it was crappy at the time, but a boss said we had to do this, or we needed to get something pushed out before we went on vacation. There's a lot of reasons why something may be like that. And with this, you can just kind of see, oh, why is that thing? So this is GitHub, looking at Drupal, looking at index.php. There's a blame button that you can press on any GitHub file. And then you can see line by line who was responsible for the most recent update to that line. Some of these are from 18 years ago, which is just bananas. And of course, other debugging techniques, walk away. Seriously. When you're getting really frustrated, sometimes the best thing to do is just stand up and walk away. I used to work with a guy who insisted that his walks were billable time. And as far as I know, the clients never noticed. So, thinking is thinking. Talk to a coworker or a rubber duck. If you've never heard of rubber duck debugging, the idea is when you're working on a problem, that problem is tangled up in your brain. You think you know all of the assumptions of a given thing. But if you stop and you try to explain the problem to a coworker or a friend or an inanimate object, and you're forced to start from the beginning, you can actually replay the entire scenario, and you will often run into the fix or the answer you're looking for at that moment as you're explaining from the beginning. So the idea is explain the problem to something, to the air, to your chair, to a friend, as if they have no idea what you're talking about, and they usually won't, but they don't have to know. They just have to sit there and listen, and maybe they'll point out something very obvious that you've overlooked because you're very hung up on something else, or just the process can be really, really helpful for getting it out. And believe it or not, in the year 2018, write it down by hand. There's been some studies that show that there is a difference between typing and writing. They are two different paths in the brain. I've often, when I'm dealing with a bunch of if-elses, I'll sit down and I'll make a chart, to do a grid and put all the variables on one side, all the conditions on the other, and I'll start making check marks to make sure that every single code path is covered, to make sure that I know, okay, if this happens, that's where the bug is. I've found, code paths where it just dies that you don't notice until like a very specific set of conditions are met. And if possible, make the future a little easier. Do some logging, write some logging output. You can use the syslog module, which will write all of your Drupal stuff onto log files on the server, which you can then send out to a service. You can set up a Belk stack or Loggly or Sumo Logic account, and you can start proactively setting alerts. So we use Sumo Logic at work, and we know when an error happens, and say it happens 3 times in a day, we get an email. And we know that now we need to start thinking about that thing. It's really great. And if you have the time, write a test. This is something I'm trying to get a lot better at because I've been working on Drupal. And for a long time, Drupal people didn't really test stuff. In the last couple of years, we've been trying to fix that, I think, as a community, which is really nice. I'm a big fan of Behat. Behat is what they call functional testing. It literally opens up an imaginary browser window on the server, does some stuff, looks at the page, and decides if it's right or not. So it's really useful for finding CSS errors. It's really useful for finding, like if an image is moving around when it's not supposed to. You can do some really powerful stuff. And I think if you have if you have time to write a single test, Behat is kind of the way to go because you can cover a lot of possibilities really quickly. Further reading, so these are just some of the things that I brought up and didn't bring up, and just some other good notes, including Maniac McGee. Art of Troubleshooting is free, available online. Debugging the 9 Indispensable Rules. It is on all over the place, Amazon, all those types of things. It is really good. It is where a lot of my thought process about the scientific method came from. And then there's just some other good links. And Maniac McGee. And thank you. That's me. So a couple minutes over. If anybody wants me to go through some step 3 debugging in Chrome, I can do that because I think at this point we're just going to the party. But other than that, any questions? And thank you very much. Yes.
When I first started to learn Drupal, I was actually using Dev Desktop. One thing I found was I was doing a bunch of local sites, just dummy sites to see how Drupal worked. But when it came time for me to test out deploying it online, I was using AWS, and I found that I couldn't get it to work correctly. So to figure out what was going on, I ended up just deploying just a vanilla version of Drupal, and it ended up working. So what I ended up finding was that Dev Desktop adds a lot of additional configuration files and all that jazz.
Yeah.
I couldn't find really any good location of documentation for that sort of stuff. Do you know of any location that Acquia kind of can walk through that sort of setup for that situation?
Yeah, so Dev Desktop is a kind of a special case. It's what they consider a very opinionated tool. So it is designed to work with Drupal or work with Acquia, and like that's all they care about. I mean, docs.acquia.com has literally all of the documentation that exists. And yeah, I think that is an issue specifically with Dev Desktop. And I think that's why if you wanted to use something other than Acquia specifically, I would definitely recommend something other than Dev Desktop. It's very opinionated that way. But if you're using something like Git, it helps you, as you're doing stuff, it kind of helps you see those extra files. It gives you a little bit more visibility. But yeah, that is kind of a bummer. I think they've been talking about a version 3 of Dev Desktop. I don't know where that, I'm not part of that team, so I don't know where that lives. But you might reach out to the Dev Desktop team. If you go through our website, you should be able to find an email address to get in touch with them, just to kind of pass along some advice. Anybody else? Yes.
I'm gonna say you missed my favorite troubleshooting issue, which is just the 500.
Ah, the 500.
Because you're talking about, like a piece of content is missing.
The white screen of death.
Too often,
Yep. Yeah, and so at that point, your only visibility is through the server logs. You generally have nothing else to go off of, and that is super useful to know. And yeah, so when we're doing like sumo logic alerts, we have some that specifically like, every once in a while we deal with thousands and thousands of transactions an hour, so we're not concerned about one 500 error, which is kind of amazing. But if we see 10 in an hour, we definitely want to know about that. And so it'll send us an alert, and as part of the log files, we, whenever we're writing custom code, we dump out a lot of information into the log files so that we can see, oh, at this time a 500 happened, and over here something else happened. So we can correlate those things pretty quick, which is nice. But yes, WSOD. Anything else? All right, let's go party. Thank y'all.